The footage begins with a flicker. Not of light, but of hesitation. A young woman pauses in the doorway of her dorm, just for half a second too long, like some instinct inside her is begging her not to step forward. The camera catches everything except the reason. And that missing reason is where the nightmare begins. And they told the public she vanished, like mist, like chance, like a statistic that could be filed away in a dusty drawer with hundreds of others. Another missing college student. Another face printed on flyers that curl at the corners in grocery store windows. Another mother interviewed through shaking breath. Another father staring into the middle distance with a silence too heavy to explain. But that's not what happened, not really, because she didn't vanish. She walked, she moved, she made choices. And every one of them was recorded. And the campus sits on land that used to be something else. Almost every American institution does. That's not metaphorical. That's historical. Before the brick and the banners and the comforting promises of safety, this land belonged to families who buried things here, stories, scandals, sometimes worse. And when you build on top of that kind of silence, the silence doesn't disappear. It waits. And her name was Marissa Calder, 20 years old, political science major, quiet, but not invisible. The kind of student professors remembered not because she spoke loudly, but because she listened too carefully. Roommates described her as thoughtful, observant, the type who noticed patterns other people ignored. And sometimes, noticing patterns is the most dangerous trait a person can have. And the first camera that caught her that night sits above the west entrance of Hawthorne Hall. You've walked past cameras like it 1,000 times without thinking twice. Black dome, dust in the corners. A sense of false security. That camera watched students come and go every day. Arguments, laughter, deliveries, loneliness. But on the night Marissa disappeared, it captured something different, not dramatic, not explosive. Just wrong in a way your body understands before your mind does. And she steps out at 2 p.m., backpack over one shoulder, phone in hand. She stops, looks down the hallway behind her, waits. No one comes. She exhales, and there's that flicker again, that half-second pause, like she's listening for footsteps that never arrive, or maybe footsteps she hopes won't. And campus police would later say the footage showed nothing unusual. But people who study footage for a living know better. There is a language to movement, to posture, to hesitation. And Marissa's body is speaking loudly to anyone willing to listen, and 3 cameras follow her path across campus. Not continuously. That's the cruel design of surveillance. Always fragmented, always incomplete. Just enough information to haunt you. In one clip, she crosses the quad alone. In another, she passes the library entrance, glancing at her reflection in the glass, as if checking whether she's still being followed. In the third, she slows near the old maintenance building, the one students avoid not because it's officially dangerous, but because something about it feels off. Too quiet, too forgotten, and this is where the public story ends, last seen walking alone. But the archive tells a different story, because there was a 4th camera, not maintained by campus security, not monitored by anyone who was supposed to be watching. A private camera, installed decades ago for reasons no one likes to talk about. A camera pointed not at safety, but at containment. And it wasn't discovered immediately, it took weeks. Weeks of pressure from a family that refused to accept the word, vanished. Weeks of digging through outdated property records, of requests denied and resubmitted, of someone finally asking the wrong question to the right retired administrator. And when they accessed the footage, they expected closure. What they found instead was a door opening that was never supposed to be seen. And what waits behind that door changes everything. And the 4th camera wasn't part of any official system. That's what made it so disturbing. It belonged to an older network, one that predated modern surveillance protocols, installed during a period when the university faced a scandal so severe that donors demanded discretion instead of transparency. The camera sat above a narrow side entrance of the maintenance building, its lens yellowed with age, its timestamp permanently stuck 7 minutes behind real time, forgotten by most, but not by the building itself, and the footage begins the same way as the others, grainy, silent, uneventful. The concrete walkway stretches empty beneath a flickering security light. Leaves move across the frame in slow, erratic patterns. Time crawls. Then at 9:58 p.m., according to the camera's faulty clock, Marissa enters the frame. And she doesn't walk confidently this time. Her stride is shorter, uneven. She keeps looking over her shoulder. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone skimming the footage to care. But enough that once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Her hand never leaves her phone. Her thumb hovers as though she's debating whether to call someone, or whether calling would make things worse, and she reaches the door. And this is where everything changes. And the maintenance building door was not supposed to open from the outside without a keycard. That was policy. That was what the university assured the public. But on the footage, you can see her hesitate only briefly before the door swings inward. Not forced, not pried, opened, and by whom is where the official record becomes carefully vague, and the university's statement would later say the footage was inconclusive. That lighting conditions made identification impossible, that no other individual could be confirmed. But that's the language of liability, not of truth, and because if you watch closely frame by frame, you begin to notice something standing just beyond the threshold. Not a clear shape, not a face, just a distortion, a shadow that doesn't behave like shadow. It leans slightly forward as she steps closer as if anticipating her arrival, and Marissa reacts to it, and her shoulders tense. Her head tilts upward like she's listening to someone taller than her. Her mouth moves, and there is no audio, but she is speaking, and that detail alone haunted the technician who reviewed the tape. He would later describe it as the worst part. Not fear, not panic, but familiarity, the way people look when they recognize someone they didn't expect to see. When they're trying to understand why that person is there, and she stands there for nearly 6 seconds. 6 seconds that feel like minutes when you know what happens next. Then she steps inside, and the door closes, and she is never seen again, and campus police initially claimed the camera glitched after that the footage corrupted, that technology failed. But when Marissa's older brother obtained a copy through legal channels months later, he found something different. The tape did not end, it continued recording for another 3 hours, and the hallway inside the maintenance building is visible in faint grayscale, concrete walls, exposed pipes, a place not designed for people to linger. The door Marissa entered through remains shut, no movement, no sign of her, just empty corridor and flickering light, and until 11:17 p.m. and that's when the door opens again, and slowly, and not with urgency, not with chaos, but with control, and a figure exits, face obscured by shadow, posture upright, unhurried. They pause in the doorway for a moment that feels deliberate, like they know someone someday will be watching this footage, like they want to be seen just enough to unsettle, but not enough to be caught, and they step out of frame. And Marissa does not follow, and the official investigation never publicly acknowledged this segment of the tape. It never appeared in press conferences, it never made it into news coverage. Instead, the narrative became simpler, easier. A young woman wandered off campus, a tragedy, an unknown suspect, a cold case, but cold cases don't usually come with suppressed footage, and they don't usually come with sealed university archives. And because Marissa didn't just disappear into darkness, and she walked into a system that had been hiding its own sins for decades. And then once you begin tracing that system backward, you start to see that her story was never isolated, and it was part of a pattern. A pattern buried so deep beneath institutional silence that uncovering it would threaten everything the university claimed to be. And patterns are rarely obvious at first. They hide inside paperwork, in footnotes, in the language institutions use when they want something to disappear without admitting it ever existed. When Marissa's family pushed for access to older records, they were told those files were lost in a flood. That phrase appears often in American history: fires, accidents, convenient erasures, but what survived in fragments was enough to reveal a shape beneath the surface. And 3 other students over the last 25 years had vanished within a mile of the same building. Not all in the same way, not all with cameras involved, but always at night, always after being seen speaking with someone they seemed to know. Always followed by the same slow response, the same careful press statements, the same institutional language designed to exhaust rather than to explain. And one of them was a sophomore named Daniel Ruiz, 2004. Officially, he left campus voluntarily. His dorm key was found on his desk. His car remained in the parking lot. His bank account untouched. His mother still keeps his room exactly as it was. Another was Tasha Greer, 2011. Last seen near the utilities corridor behind the science wing. Her case was quietly folded into a broader category called runaway youth, despite the fact that she had no history of running from anything. The third was a graduate student, Elias Morton, 2018. He vanished during winter break when campus was nearly empty. His disappearance barely made the news at all, and different names, different years, different lives, and same silence afterward. And when Marissa's brother began mapping the timelines, he noticed something else. Each disappearance coincided with periods when the university was negotiating major donations. New buildings, endowments, expansion plans, moments when reputation mattered more than truth, moments when bad publicity would have meant millions lost. And this is the part of the story where people want to look away, because it forces a harder question. Not who did this, but who allowed it. And universities are not just schools, they are corporations, political entities, historical fortresses, and like any fortress built on compromised foundations, they develop systems not just to educate, but to protect themselves. Legal departments grow larger. Risk management offices become more powerful. Internal investigations quietly replace police involvement. Everything is framed as liability. Everything becomes about containment, and then somewhere along the way, human beings become inconvenient variables, and the maintenance building itself has a history that predates its current name. Before it was repurposed for storage and utilities, it served a different function. A function the university does not advertise on tours. Old blueprints refer to it as an observation annex, not for research, not for experiments, for observation, of whom is never specified, but older faculty records. The kind that survive in personal collections rather than official archives, mention disciplinary holding rooms, private interviews, situations handled, housed to preserve institutional integrity. And it's easy to dismiss this as outdated, as relics of a harsher era. But architecture remembers purpose. Walls built for secrecy retain it. Corridors designed to isolate still feel wrong to walk through decades later. And cameras placed to monitor rather than protect often stay in place long after their original justification is forgotten. And the retired administrator who helped Marissa's brother access the old footage didn't want his name used. But he said something that still echoes through this entire case. He said, "There are systems here older than any of us, and they don't like being disturbed." And he didn't mean that metaphorically. And he was talking about committees, policies, agreements made in closed rooms that outlast the people who originally signed them, protocols for handling incidents quietly, relationships between the university and local authorities that prioritize stability over scrutiny, an understanding that certain problems are better managed internally. And when Marissa stepped into that building, she didn't just step into a hallway, she stepped into the long shadow of those systems. And then the most unsettling part is this: someone inside that system knew her. And because that door didn't open for strangers, and it opened because someone expected her to be there. And there's a lie people like to believe about danger, that it announces itself, that it wears a mask, or raises its voice, or forces its way into your life. But the truth, the kind buried in institutional corridors and sealed records, is much quieter. Real danger often arrives through familiarity, through trust, through the soft assurance that someone belongs. And Marissa's phone was recovered 2 days after she vanished. Not by police, not through official channels. It was found by a janitor in a trash bin behind the administrative wing, wrapped carefully in a syllabus from her ethics class. No cracks, no signs of struggle, just powered off, as if placed, not discarded. And the university claimed it proved nothing. But phones tell stories even when they're silent, and her brother had the device examined independently. Not by law enforcement, but by a private digital forensics specialist who worked more often with corporate whistleblowers than criminal cases. What he found didn't offer answers so much as it opened another door. And in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Marissa had been communicating with someone saved in her contacts under the name Advisor. No last name, no faculty listing matched it. The number was registered to a prepaid account that had been activated only 3 months earlier. Their messages weren't dramatic. That's the part that makes them harder to forget, and they were subtle, polite, carefully worded. And you're asking the right questions, and some things are easier to explain in person. And be careful who you share this with. Not everyone here wants the truth exposed, and it read less like grooming, more like cultivation, as though someone had identified her curiosity not as a threat, but as a resource to be managed. And Marissa had been working on a research paper about historical misconduct in American institutions. Nothing radical, nothing fringe, but she had requested access to archived disciplinary records, the kind most students never know exist, the kind stored not for learning but for control. Her professor approved the topic. The administration delayed access. Weeks passed. Then, suddenly permission was granted with conditions. Limited time supervised access, certain boxes off limits. And that's when the messages began. And there is something deeply unsettling about the idea that someone was watching her academic behavior closely enough to intervene. Not because she was dangerous, but because she was thorough. And one message, sent 3 days before she disappeared, stands out. And you've gone far enough that they've noticed. If you want the rest, you can't go through official channels anymore. And she replied only once. And what do I do? And there was no further text response. But her calendar shows an entry added that same night. No title, just a time, 9:45 p.m. location MB Annex, and the maintenance building. And people want monsters to look like monsters. They want villains to be obvious. But what Marissa's story suggests is something more disturbing. That the person who led her there may have sounded reasonable, educated, concerned. That they may have framed secrecy as protection and isolation as necessity. That they may have convinced her she was being invited into something rare, important, privileged. And because institutions don't only suppress with force, and they recruit with purpose, and then once you see it, You begin to recognize the pattern elsewhere. Whistleblowers silenced not through threats, but through reassignment. Journalists discredited not with evidence, but with whispers. Students discouraged not with bans, but with guidance. The slow shaping of who is allowed to know and who must remain in the dark. And the figure on the camera didn't rush because they didn't need to. They weren't afraid of being stopped. They weren't worried about being recognized. They moved with the confidence of someone who understood the architecture around them, not just physically, but politically, and someone who knew the cameras that worked, and someone who knew the cameras that didn't, and perhaps most importantly, someone who knew that even if questions were asked later, the system would protect itself before it protected the truth. And because Marissa wasn't taken in a moment of chaos, and she was guided into silence by someone who had been trained to make silence feel safe. And there is a moment in every buried story when the archive begins to resist, when doors close more tightly, when calls go unanswered, when people who were once willing to speak suddenly remember they have nothing to say. That moment arrived shortly after Marissa's brother began asking about one specific name that kept appearing at the edges of every document, and not in faculty lists. Not on public directories, in meeting notes, in the kind of correspondence never meant to leave institutional walls, and the initials were simple RL, and they appeared next to phrases like handled internally, and do not escalate, and approved per RL, and refer to RL before proceeding, and no job title, no department, just authority. And when he asked administrators who RL was, responses varied. Some claimed they didn't recognize the initials. Others said it might refer to a retired staff member. A few suggested it could be a legal consultant. But there was a pattern in the discomfort, in the way conversations ended abruptly after the question was asked, in the subtle way emails stopped coming, and he wasn't the first to notice. And years earlier, the mother of Daniel Ruiz had requested documentation about the internal handling of her son's disappearance. Her request had been denied, her appeals ignored, but in a handwritten letter to a local journalist that never went to print, she wrote something chilling. There is one person they all defer to. I don't know who he is, but I know everyone is afraid of him. And the journalist shelved the story. Later said the evidence wasn't solid enough. Later admitted off record that his editor had received a call from someone connected to the university's board. And the more Marissa's brother uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one predator hiding behind institutional walls. This was about a role, a function, a person whose job was not officially acknowledged, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the system had built in mechanisms for erasure, and not discipline, and not justice, and erasure. And around this point in the story, most people instinctively pull back. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are heavy. Because it suggests that beneath the reassuring architecture of education, prestige, and tradition, there exists a quieter structure devoted not to truth, but to containment. And this is where I want to pause for a moment. Because if you're still listening to this story, still following the thread through these corridors of silence, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If it was your sister, your son, your name buried in paperwork that didn't want to be read, and the last known digital footprint from Marissa's phone wasn't a text, it wasn't a call, it was a voice memo unsent, unshared, recorded at 9:53 p.m. and the audio is poor, static hum, fabric shifting, breathing, and then her voice, low, uncertain. But he says this is how it has to be, and she doesn't say who is, but the word choice matters.
Not they, not someone.
He. And there is another pause, longer, and if anything happens, I need someone to know that I didn't just walk away. And the recording ends there, and no hysteria, no screaming, just clarity. And people often misunderstand what real fear sounds like. They expect panic. What they hear instead is resignation. The kind that comes when someone realizes they've stepped too far into something they don't yet understand, but no longer feel able to retreat from. And the figure on the camera, and the prepaid phone, and the sealed archives, and the consistent disappearances aligned with institutional vulnerability. And none of it points to randomness. And it points to structure. And then the most disturbing possibility of all is this: Marissa may have been getting closer to something real, something dangerous, something that someone inside the system believed needed to be stopped before it reached daylight. And not because it was false, but because it was true, and truth has a weight to it, not emotional weight, structural weight, the kind that buckles systems when it's introduced. That's why institutions spend decades engineering ways to keep it from surfacing. And that's why, once Marissa's brother crossed a certain invisible line, the resistance stopped being subtle, and it started with small disruptions. His emails to faculty began bouncing back without explanation. His access to public campus buildings was quietly revoked, not banned, not officially. His ID simply stopped working on doors that used to open without question. The university said it was a system error. They said many things were system errors, and then came the stranger things. And a neighbor reported seeing someone sitting in a parked car across the street late at night, engine off, lights dark. Not every night, just often enough to be noticed. His phone developed a habit of powering down unexpectedly. His private investigator quit without warning, returning half the payment with a message that read only, "This isn't about money, and fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it instructs." But the most important thing he uncovered during this period didn't come from surveillance or technology. It came from an elderly woman named Ruth Alderman, who had worked as a records clerk at the university for 30 years before retiring quietly into a small house filled with filing boxes she was never asked to return. And she didn't recognize Marissa's name at first, but when shown the still frame from the fourth camera, the one of the shadowed figure exiting the maintenance building, she went very still. "And I've seen that posture before," she said, "and not a face, not a certainty, just posture. The way the shoulders sat, the way the head inclined forward slightly, as though accustomed to being listened to." And Ruth explained that for most of her career, there had been a man who never appeared on staff lists, but always appeared in workflows. Decisions would stall until he approved them. Sensitive complaints would vanish after he reviewed them. Certain students, usually those who asked too many questions, filed too many requests, pushed too hard against sealed boundaries, would be flagged for intervention, and not punishment, and intervention, and the word was used gently, comfortingly, as if something benevolent were being offered, and Ruth never knew his full name, only his initials, RL, and she said he never raised his voice, never threatened anyone. That was the unnerving part. He didn't need to. People complied because he represented something larger than himself. He represented continuity, the quiet understanding that some roles existed not on paper, but in practice. That some functions of an institution were never meant to be spoken aloud. And when asked if she believed he was still active in recent years, she hesitated. "And roles like that don't retire," she said. "They're inherited," and that single word reframes everything. And inherited, and not just a person, but a position passed down, a responsibility, a burden, a task, preserving the institution's survival at all costs, even when those costs are measured in human lives, careers erased, stories buried. And if that sounds extreme, consider this. Almost every major institution in American history has had its own version of this. Unofficial fixers, quiet handlers, people whose job was to ensure that destabilizing truths never made it beyond certain walls. Sometimes they worked for governments, sometimes for corporations, sometimes for churches, sometimes for universities, and then they are almost never written into the official history. And because history is not written by those who maintain silence, and it's written by those who break it. And Marissa may have been trying to do exactly that. And her research topic, her requests for sealed records, her communications with someone presenting themselves as a guide, all of it suggests she had reached a point where curiosity intersected with something real enough to trigger containment protocols that had existed long before she was born. And here is the hardest part to sit with. It's possible she was never meant to disappear, and it's possible the system intended only to redirect her, to scare her, to isolate her, to make her doubt herself. But systems like this are brittle. They rely on precision, on control, on everyone playing their role correctly. And then when something goes wrong inside a system built on secrecy, there is no safety net, and only silence. And then silence, once it closes around someone, is very difficult to escape. And by the time this story reaches its end, most people want a single, clean answer, a confession, a body, a courtroom, something that lets the mind close the file and walk away. But that's not how buried systems unravel. They don't collapse with a crash, they erode with whispers, and months after Ruth spoke, her house was broken into. Not ransacked, not vandalized, just opened. File boxes disturbed, but nothing stolen that a stranger would value. Only the folders with university letterheads were gone. When asked by police what she thought happened, she gave an answer that felt older than fear. "They're cleaning the record," she said. "They always clean the record." And Marissa's brother understood then that the fight wasn't just against a person. It was against time itself, against a culture that had learned to outlast outrage, to wait out grief, to survive truth by exhausting those who carried it. But one thing the system hadn't accounted for was replication, and he began sharing everything he had gathered, not in one explosive reveal, but in fragments, anonymous uploads, encrypted forums, independent journalists who didn't rely on university access for credibility, the fourth camera footage, the message transcripts, the redacted documents showing RL's initials appearing like fingerprints across decades. He didn't frame it as accusation. He framed it as record, and records are harder to erase once they're dispersed. And a former faculty member recognized the maintenance building. A graduate from 10 years earlier admitted she'd once been summoned there after filing a complaint and told, gently, that pursuing it further would harm everyone involved. A campus security officer, now retired, confessed that there were blind spots in the camera system that were never accidents. They were designed, and no one offered a smoking gun. No one provided a name that could be prosecuted. But what emerged instead was something more damning: a collective recognition, a shared unease, a realization among strangers that they had all been brushed by the same invisible architecture of control and had simply never compared notes before. And that's the danger of silence, and it isolates. And truth, when spoken aloud in enough voices, does the opposite, and the university issued a statement, of course. They always do, expressed sympathy, reaffirmed commitment to safety, announced an internal review, promised transparency. The language was immaculate, polished by generations of practice. But something had shifted, because now people were reading between the lines, watching the footage, asking why certain cameras existed and others didn't, asking why certain names never appeared in directories but shaped outcomes all the same. And Marissa's case remains officially unsolved. No closure, no resolution, neat enough for headlines. Her room was cleared out, her scholarship reassigned, her name gradually removed from institutional memory, as these stories so often are. But not from the archive she never intended to create. And because the truth she touched didn't vanish with her, it lingered, in documents copied before they could be destroyed, in conversations finally spoken aloud, in the uneasy awareness now carried by students who walk past that maintenance building and feel, perhaps for the first time, that their discomfort has a history, and maybe that's the real legacy here, and not a solved mystery, but a broken pattern, and systems that rely on secrecy survive only when no one dares to connect the dots, when everyone assumes their experience is isolated, when fear convinces each person to keep quiet. But once the pattern is seen, once the archive opens, once the footage is watched with eyes that refuse to look away, the silence loses its power, and some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. And some cameras, once noticed, can no longer hide. And some names, even when erased from official records, continue to echo through the spaces where they once stood, reminding anyone who listens closely enough that the truth was here, and someone tried to bury it,